A kata is something you practice, not something you watch. Read the lesson, write the code yourself, then review what you wrote. This video is the reference you come back to afterwards. A model can produce this code in seconds, and the reason to write it by hand is to keep the judgment that tells you whether the code is any good. This lesson is about the difference between a component and an element. A component is a function you write. An element is the object that function call produces. They are easy to blur together because JSX makes them look the same on the page. Getting them apart explains why calling a component directly breaks its hooks, and why React can sometimes skip re-rendering part of your tree. A React element is a plain JavaScript object. It describes what you want on the screen and nothing more. It has a type, some props, and a key. That is the whole shape of it. An element is immutable, so once it exists, you do not change its props or its children. Creating one is cheap because you are only allocating a small object. React holds on to these objects and compares the new ones against the old ones to work out what actually has to change in the DOM. A component is a function that takes props and returns elements. It is the definition, not the result. The component says how to build a piece of UI, and the element is one particular piece built from it. React is the one that calls your function. You hand React the element, React decides when to invoke the component behind it, and React keeps track of the state and effects that belong to each call. You can see the difference at runtime without any tooling. Ask for the type of the component itself and you get back a function. Ask for the type of the element the component produces and you get back an object. That is the whole distinction in one line of output. React treats the two differently for exactly that reason. A function is something to call later. An object is a description to compare against the last one. JSX is a syntax extension, not a language feature. A JSX tag compiles down to a createElement call, and createElement returns the element object we have been describing. So writing an angle bracket greeting tag and writing createElement of greeting produce exactly the same object. Neither one calls the greeting function. This is worth holding on to because it is the step where most of the confusion starts. Writing the tag builds a description. Something else has to decide when to run it. Element identity is what React checks during reconciliation. When React walks the tree, it compares the new element in a position against the element that was there before. If it is the exact same object, by reference, React knows nothing in that subtree can have changed, so it skips it. That is a real bailout, not an optimization you have to ask for. It is also the mechanism behind passing elements through as children. A parent that re-renders does not rebuild the children it was handed, so those children keep their identity and get skipped. The lesson has a demo that puts the two side by side. One element is created once and kept in state. The other is written inline, so a fresh object is built on every render. Both render the same component and both look identical on screen. Then you re-render the parent and only the inline one counts up. The stored element is the same object it was before, so React leaves that subtree alone. The inline element is a new object every time, so React has to go and check it. A few things are worth stating plainly because they trip people up. Writing a JSX tag does not call the component function. It builds an element and React calls the function later. An element is not a component. The component is the function and the element is the object it describes. Creating elements is not the expensive part. Rendering is, because rendering is where your function actually runs. And calling a component directly as a plain function is not the same as rendering it. React never sees a separate component there, so the hooks inside it get attributed to whoever called it. A component is a function that returns elements. An element is a plain object describing what to render. JSX compiles to createElement, which builds that object without invoking your function. React calls your component during rendering on its own schedule. And when the same element object comes back in the same position, React can skip that part of the tree. The practical rule that falls out of all of it is to let React call your components by rendering elements rather than calling them yourself. The playground ships this lesson in 3 implementations, and the first one is the mistake start at the top. It imports useState from React, and that is the only import it needs. Below that is greeting, a component taking a name prop. It holds its own state, a wave count starting at 0, and it returns a div with the name, the count, and a button that increments the count. On its own, that component is completely ordinary. Now look at app underneath it. App holds its own piece of state, a boolean called show, and renders a heading and a button that toggles it. The last line inside the div is the one that matters. Greeting is called as a plain function with an object argument rather than rendered as a tag. It works in the sense that something appears on screen, but React never learns that greeting exists. There is no separate component here, only app calling a function that happens to run a hook. So the wave count is app's state, not greetings, and the comment above that line says exactly that. Watch what the toggle does. Hiding greeting changes how many hooks app runs, and the hook order React depends on stops being stable. Try clicking wave a few times and then toggling. This is the same file with one line change. The imports are the same, and greeting above is unchanged, still holding its own wave count and rendering the same markup. App is unchanged too, right down to the toggle button and the show state. The difference is the last line. Greeting is written as a JSX tag now, with name passed as an attribute rather than as an object argument. That single change means the expression builds an element instead of calling the function. App hands that element to React. React sees a greeting component and it gives that component its own place to keep state. Now the wave count belongs to greeting where it was always meant to be. Toggling it off unmounts the component and its state goes with it, which is the behavior you would expect. The background color changed from red to green, so the two versions are easy to tell apart when you flip between them. Nothing else about the file moved. The third implementation is the evidence for everything in the lesson. The imports are wider here. Use state, create element, and use ref. Greeting at the top is trimmed down to a heading because it is only being used as something to point at. Then render counter, which is the measuring instrument, it takes a label and it keeps a count in a ref rather than in state. A ref is the right tool because incrementing it does not cause a render, so it can count renders without changing the thing it is counting. Below that, describe element is a helper that takes an element and prints its type, its props, and its key as readable text. That is how the page shows you the inside of an element object. Now up. It holds a count in state for forcing re-renders. It builds an element from a JSX tag and a second element from a createElement call with the same component and the same props. And it builds a third element inside a useState initializer so that one is created once and kept. The initializer is a function on purpose. That is what makes it run only on the first render. The markup below is 3 numbered sections that each show one of those. Section 1 prints the type of greeting and the type of the element, function against object with the element's contents underneath. Section 2 prints the createElement version, and you can compare the two blocks and see the same object. Section 3 is the identity demo, a button that bumps the parents count, then the stored element, then an inline render counter. Press the button and watch the two counters diverge. Change the label strings and rerun, then try moving the stored element into the markup as a plain tag and see the difference disappear. The short version is that a component is the function and an element is the object. JSX builds objects, React calls the functions. Everything else in this lesson follows from that, including why the hooks broke in the first implementation and why one counter stopped counting in the third. The kata is the part that matters. Open the lesson, write the code yourself, then read back what you wrote and judge it. The link is in the description, and that practice is what keeps the skill yours.